Not only has our history and very being as Indigenous peoples been passed down through story, but we hold the power to control that narrative. It is so incredibly important that we tell stories of our brilliance and of what we believe our communities can look like. And if you keep telling that story and you don't stray, it will come to be.
Hello, welcome to the Ecopolitics Podcast, Season 4, The Politics of the Anthropocene. This is a podcast for students and researchers tackling some of the key questions and challenges in the field of environmental politics today. My name is Peter Andrée. I teach at Carleton University in Ottawa, located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. So usually my co-host for the Ecopolitics Podcast is Ryan Katz-Rosene from the University of Ottawa. But Ryan won't be joining us today. Instead, for this episode and for the next, I'm joined in the co-host chair by Tehya Quachegan. Tehya is a master's student at Lakehead University. Lakehead is located in Thunder Bay, also known as Tehya Quachegan. It's the territory of the Fort William First Nation, signatories to the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850. So Tehya, welcome, and how would you like to introduce yourself to our audience today?
Wajay, Tehya Quachegan, Neshta Wawazagane Kwe, Nishinakaswan, Moose Factory Natuchin. So hello everybody. My name is Tehya Quachegan. I am from Moose Factory and a member of Moose Cree First Nation. I'm an environmental studies student and have a research focus of youth perspectives on food sovereignty in Treaty 9 territory. I'm passionate about Indigenous youth empowerment and life promotion. I also come from a family of hunters and fishermen, but many of my relatives still suffer from diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, and cancers that can all be linked to what we put in our body. These factors fuel my interest in food activism, as I want to encourage other youth, and especially those from northern remote communities such as my own, to learn more about food sovereignty and how we can make healthy and culturally relevant foods more accessible in our communities.
I'm so excited that you're joining us for this episode. These episodes are intended as a podcast introduction to the Living Relations Partnership. Tehya has been spending the last few months getting to know members of the Living Relations team through interviews they conducted with each other in August of 2024. She's here to share some of what she's been learning with Ecopolitics podcast listeners. So Tehya, what is the Living Relationship Partnership all about from your perspective?
The Living Relations Project is a collaboration between Indigenous and settler partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Canada. It's about rethinking food systems in the face of climate change, colonialism, and biodiversity loss. From 2024 to 2027, this team of researchers and community activists are working together to share stories of how communities are strengthening Indigenous food sovereignty and building resilience, both for Indigenous communities and wider society. This work is all about restoring relationships to land, water, food, and each other.
That's a great way to sum it up, Tehya. At this point, I should mention that I'm one of the co-directors of the Living Relations Partnership, alongside Dr. John Reid from the Naitahu Research Centre at the University of Canterbury. Listeners may remember John from a previous episode we did on agriculture and climate change in Aotearoa. And in fact, John will be back to join you and I, Tehya, in our second episode about the Living Relations Project. So while John and I are the co-directors of this project, the Living Relations Partnership is guided by an Indigenous advisory circle that includes experts on food systems, sustainability, and food sovereignty from both Aotearoa and Canada. The project emphasizes values like relationality, reciprocity, responsibility, respect, and reverence. We work with concepts like ethical space and two-eyed seeing to build bridges between Indigenous and Western knowledge systems, and between our two continents. We also emphasize intergenerational knowledge transfer to help guide the next generation of researchers, community activists, and storytellers. So, Tehya, where do you want to take us in this first episode?
Thanks, Peter. Well, as a student, I'm really interested in how these partnership projects work. How can communities and researchers work together to further food sovereignty and environmental protection? Food insecurity is often presented as an individual's challenge, which ignores the systems currently in place that are contributing to the problem. To tackle these systems and work towards food security, I think it's important to see it as a challenge that we need to work on collectively. This partnership project demonstrates that ability to work as a collective, expanding across nations and oceans. I'm excited to explore what we can learn between Canada and New Zealand. What can we learn from each other across these two similar, but also quite different, settler-colonial contexts where Indigenous resurgence is strong? In this episode, we'll start to answer these questions, hearing from Indigenous leaders, youth, researchers, and community members who are revitalizing food systems grounded in culture and place.
That sounds great, Tehya. So how do you want to begin?
Let's start by meeting some of the people involved in this work and the places that shaped them. We'll have each person introduce themselves as they did when they interviewed one another. As you already mentioned, these conversations took place at the Living Relations Project gathering in August of 2024.
Yes, that's right. About 15 members of the advisory and research circles met last August in Endaki, which is the traditional territory of the Tehya Anishinaabe in northeastern Ontario. We gathered to get to know one another better, participate in ceremony, and talk through how we're going to work together moving forward. We also spent time engaging directly with the members of the Tehya Anishinaabe and Temagami First Nation by holding a public event at the TFN's reserve on Lake Temagami, known as Bear Island. So are we going to hear from everyone now?
Let's just start with introductions from the people we'll hear from in this episode. And just so you're aware, if you hear crickets or pots and pans banging in the background, it's because these interviews were taped as conversations between members of the project team. Many were first getting to know one another at a summer camp known as Camp Wanapate on the north end of Lake Temagami. Okay, so first, let me introduce Mary Laurent from the Tehya Anishinaabe, on whose traditional territory the Living Relations gathering took place.
To me, language is an expression of your relationship to your land. So the land basically forms your language, I think, over time, like it's a relational. It's subjective, it's not objective. It's the language itself is about relationship. So I think as the Indigenous people here, we have a responsibility to the land itself and to the earth and her water. We have a responsibility to protect those.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Te Aue Edison Wala Awahau, he uri tēnei no kaitahu tiatiawa me tūwhare toa hoki, kei Canada hau I tēnei wā I te taha o ngā tangata whenua no konei. So kia ora everyone, hail from Aotearoa, New Zealand. My tribes that I have connections to are tūwhare toa in the central North Island and to Kaitahu and Tiatiawa at the top of the South Island. I work as a principal advisor for a Crown Research Centre in New Zealand called Plant and Food Research. And so we have a strong focus on supporting Māori economic development across horticulture, viticulture and seafood opportunities. And so I work in a department that looks to support iwi and Indigenous businesses transition to more sustainable food practices.
So that was Mary, and right after Mary, we heard the voice of Te Aue Addison Valau. She came from Aotearoa to participate in the gathering with her mentor, Jan Hanya, who we'll meet later. Next, let me introduce two other members of the advisory circle, Eden Skipper and Nikki Hutton.
Kia ora koutou, ko Eden Skipper toko ingoa. My name is Eden Skipper. I am a tribal member of Ngāi Tahu Iwi, specifically Ngāti Mako subtribe. Our subtribe is known for many things in Wairewa Lake, but one of them is specifically eeling.
Hey, I'm Nikki from Ngāti First Nation in Mayo, Yukon. Fear was really one of the biggest things that sparked me to even get involved in any of this at all. It's like I just kind of felt like I needed to just start doing more because there's just aren't enough things in place for everybody to get what they need out of life there. And so I wanted to help address that.
Next, Trish Balamingi and Charles Lebko are both professors and members of the Living Relations Research Circle.
I'm Trish Balamingi from the unceded Algonquin territory upon which Carleton University is situated, originally from Montreal. We've been involved in myriad projects, and my focus has been around food systems broadly, Indigenous food sovereignty, more specifically, food security a little bit. When I think about the Living Relationships Project, to me it's really exciting, the idea of bringing into conversation Indigenous peoples around struggles that resonate across spaces, across cultures and geographies.
I'm Charles Levko. I'm a professor at Lakehead University. My official title is Canada Research Chair in Equitable and Sustainable Food Systems. I'm a father. I like to grow things. I'm interested in tearing down systems and building better ones. And as a community organizer going back to university, I still look now and say, like, I never in a million years would have thought I would be a professor, because I always thought I'd always be doing community work. And I've managed in my career, at least, to keep doing this community work and stay very connected to the people, to the places I am.
Finally, let me introduce Jan Hanya. He is one of the co-chairs of the Indigenous Advisory Circle.
Kia ora, I'm Jan Hania from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I don't have an explicit role, but I sort of work in the space in between of a number of projects and interface of Indigenous evolutions or developments to, restore equity, sovereignty and circularity, and as well as restore the earth in any ways that we can. I'm also a father and a grandson, and possibly a grandfather in time to come, and so feel connected to the All Earth, but still I'm very much a student of life.
Thanks, Tehya. So that was a great way to meet the members of the Living Relations team that we're going to be hearing from today. And I know you spent a lot of time listening to the conversations that they had with each other last August. So what really stood out for you, that helped you understand how these projects actually work, as you said, across these different contexts in a project that's seeking to advance food sovereignty and sustainability?
Yeah, I really loved listening to all the conversations and getting to know everyone. But one of the first things I noticed is that what everyone spoke about was really grounded in their relationship to the places they're from.
That's such a neat thing to pick up on, and it sounds like a great place to start. So give me some examples.
Well, why don't we listen to these quotes I picked out in particular, and I think you'll hear what I mean. The first person you'll hear from is Mary, then we'll also hear from Jan and Teawe.
This is a land of water, it really is. And our name, it means people of the deep water by the shore. That's what Tamiagaming means. So when you say put the gaming on the end, that means lake. So Temiagama, it means people of the deep water by the shore.
I was lucky to live next to a harbour that was abundant with food gathering of scallops and mussels, and we had a garden, and I was able to go and play every day on the beach for the tide that came in and out. So our life was sort of governed by tides and change and food.
One of the things that I guess I draw strength from is I actually grew up where my ahika is, and so that means where the long fires will always burn. So that's the place where my people have resided for years.
Wow. What I hear in these quotes, Tehya, is not just how our team members identify with their lands and waters, but also how their place-based living relations ground them and provide spiritual nourishment. This kind of grounding, I think, can be especially important for folks who work on issues like decolonization and addressing the environmental crises of our times, which is exactly what this project is all about.
Listening to these stories, I feel a deep sense of connection, not just to my own family and territory, but to this much bigger web of people who care deeply about the land and who share common interests in Indigenous food systems. As a young Indigenous scholar and activist, it reminds me that this work is not only necessary, but also possible.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, Tehya. So what was the next theme you picked up from listening to these conversations?
It struck me that while so-called Canada and Aotearoa are so far apart on the planet, they have a similar shared history of colonization. I can see how today's work of decolonization and Indigenous cultural resurgence can benefit by sharing between these two contexts.
Yeah, you're right, Tehya. There are important differences between the two places. For example, in Aotearoa, there's just one language that all Maori people speak, even if they have tribal dialects. While in so-called Canada, there are over 600 recognized First Nations communities speaking over 50 languages. And the Indigenous people of Canada also include the Inuit, who live in the far north, as well as distinct Métis communities who are descended from the union between some First Nations women and European men during the fur trade era. Another key difference is that in Aotearoa, tribes have a single treaty with the British Crown, known as Te Tiriti o Waitangi, signed in 1840, after the British Crown had already acknowledged a declaration of independence by a group of Maori leaders in 1835. While Te Tiriti o Waitangi was never properly honored by the Crown, having a single treaty as the basis of ongoing claims against the government has really shaped Indigenous settler politics and efforts to further decolonization in Aotearoa, New Zealand to this day. In contrast, in Canada, the Crown has a patchwork of treaties, from the peace and friendship treaties established with the Mi'kmaq on the East Coast in the 1700s to the numbered treaties established between the Canadian government and various First Nations between 1871 and 1921. Then there are lots of parts of Canada that never had treaties signed between Indigenous people and the Crown, like where I live on Anishinaabe land near Ottawa. And in some parts of Canada, what are called the modern treaties have only been signed in recent decades, mostly as a result of a push by companies to get access to resource wealth on Indigenous lands.
And that's the common denominator here, isn't it? Colonization and treaty making for the sake of getting settlers access to land, with the huge price to be paid by the peoples of those lands, right?
Yeah, part of what this project confronts is the reality that colonial governments actively work to dismantle Indigenous cultures, languages, and connections to land and food. Tehya, would you be willing to share a bit about how that history has impacted your own nation and family?
Yes, I can. For my community in Moose Factory, those impacts are still felt today. Elders have said that the written Treaty 9 didn't match what was promised orally, and people were misled into signing away their lands. Some of my grandparents and great-grandparents attended residential schools, including St. Anne's, Bishop Horton Hall, and Shingwalk. These schools took children from their families and worked to erase our language, culture, and ways of life. Ceremonies and teachings were banned, and our relationships to the land, including our food systems, were disrupted. Whole communities were even relocated to make way for settlers and industries like mining, forestry, and hydroelectric projects. These policies weren't accidents. They were intentional strategies to sever us from our lands, from each other, and from the knowledge systems that sustained us for thousands of years. And yet, despite all of it, our communities are still here.
Thanks for sharing these truly difficult details from your own family's background, Tehya, and I also hear the resilience in your words. I've previously mentioned in this podcast that I can see how Canada's institutions and economy were designed for people like me, immigrants from elsewhere, all at the direct expense of families like yours. This is all important context for the Living Relations Project, which brings Indigenous people and settlers to work together. We can only do that if we begin by collectively acknowledging the ongoing impacts of settler colonialism. So how did all this come through in the interviews?
Here are some quotes from the Living Relations team about the dynamics of colonialism as they experienced it, starting with Tehya from Aotearoa.
We had similar acts, like ours was called the Tohunga Suppression Act, which was introduced after settlers arrived as a way to stop us from practicing or cutting us off from our ceremonial practices and language as well. And then they had the Native Schools Act introduced, which was a process to completely disconnect children from their language, from their wider collective family structure. And I was speaking with Nikki earlier, and she shared about the longhouse. Yep. Is it longhouse? Yep. So we have a meeting house and similar practices. So we all had our families, not just your nuclear family, but your aunties and uncles all residing in one space. And when those practices were eroded under, we called it like pepper potting, where you'd take Māori and push them into urban environments and break their wider collective structure up and just pepper pot them within Pākehā or British families to try and assimilate us. And so we have a similar journey around the impact of urbanisation and how that's affected our sense of connection back to home and to place.
So I could really see some similarities between what I was talking about and what Tehya just shared. Another thing that stood out to me was how this work invites everyone to reflect on their own stories. Some of the settlers in the Living Relations Project shared stories about how their peoples, too, have experienced displacement, violence, and trauma, and how that shapes their connection to this work today. Here's a conversation between Jan and Charles.
As I grew up, the environment where I grew up changed, and so the food sources weren't as available. The mussels got contaminated and the scallop beds disappeared because of siltation, and at a young age became very aware of the disconnection that was occurring to our little way of life. And I went to a Māori boys' boarding school and realised there's all these other world views and sort of more kind of Indigenous ways of seeing things. It was kind of more about, whoa, even though my mum had been siphoning that into my world, it wasn't quite as explicit.
Yeah, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about, you talked a lot about what colonization has done to you and to your people. And I think a lot about what colonization, again, has done to all of us. Like, even my people came over to this place just before the Holocaust, and because of a genocide that was happening that they had to escape. And my people are very landless. We've never really had a place. And when you're talking about transitions and you're talking about ways forward and kind of ways of reclaiming, I'm wondering about how you're maybe thinking about this idea of, especially of food systems transitions in this place of, there's so much trauma that lots of people have faced and are still facing today. So the kind of, on one side, the struggle and the challenge and the difficulty and the trauma, but on the other side, the looking to do something else, to build something else, to create something that's doesn't victimize people over and over again. And so I heard that in some of what you're talking about. So maybe I'll just ask you, when you think about transitions or what that means, how do you think about that in this very complicated context?
It is affecting all of us, and there's a healing element required at both a personal and a kind of a collective level, whatever your collective scale is, family, institution, tribe. And I think presencing that is important, because unless you name it, it'll stay as a trauma or as a pain if you don't, treatment's not quite the right word, but because you're presuming there's a fixed solution, but at least presencing there is a separation and a trauma, then you can actually think about, okay, what am I feeling, what am I seeing, what are the multiple modes of going with that?
That's a really powerful statement Jan just made in response to Charles, and it's important subtext to the work we're doing in this project. In one way, this is about food sovereignty and sustainability, big concepts, but in another way, this is about much deeper work, learning to be together, to work together, and to contribute to healing deep ancestral trauma that so many of us carry in different ways.
I can see why this kind of work is so important. Building relationships, listening to each other, and trying to support communities in ways that matter. But it's not easy, is it? We're still working within institutions and structures that were designed to uphold colonialism, and that can make it really hard to do this work in a good way.
Yeah, you're right. And universities have a long history of actually being part of the problem, extracting knowledge from Indigenous peoples, for example, or taking artifacts and ancestral bones in the name of science. So the challenge for us as researchers and communities working together today is to try to avoid making these same mistakes, mostly the researchers having to not make the same mistakes. Key to me is doing this work in a relational way. That's what I'm learning from my Indigenous colleagues. And that's just a way of saying that we have to start by building relationships and then asking communities how our collective efforts can support them.
And that introduces the next theme, which is how to do this work, and that is relationship-based research. This was another theme I picked up from the conversations I listened to. Here are some thoughts from Jan and Charles.
What I hear, and often what we talk about, is your intention, of being in right relationship or doing the wholesome thing. Those words of being respectful and thinking about the reciprocity and hopefully an abundance mindset without diminishing the deprivation that totally exists is a big part of how we are to be, I think, to develop as peoples. I think that's massively important.
So a lot of the projects I'm involved in, and this kind of brings me to this project, are the community I'm working with, the people I'm in relationship with, kind of guiding me and giving me direction on what they want and how they want to be doing things. This question of, with a project like Living Relationships, as we're at the beginnings of it, the idea of who are we accountable to, right? That came up a few times today. And I feel like where we came to, at least in that early discussion, was this idea of we'll see, we have to ask people, we have to have conversation. And it comes back to this idea of maybe always checking in with each other of are we accountable to our funder, to our academic institutions, to our communities, to ourselves?
And then Trish shares how this project has grown out of previous research relationships.
I would take a step back from this particular project to explain the relationship that has evolved over time between Carleton University really broadly and the First Nation of Natchonyakdun. And that's built upon, the long-standing relationship that my colleague Chris Byrne, who's a permafrost scientist, has built over some 40 years of returning to the Yukon and to Mayo. And an MOU that was established about 5 years ago now.
Yeah, that's really neat that Trish and Charles are bringing that in, especially Trish mentioning that this project builds on those previous relationships. And what both of them and Jan are really saying here is critical. We're spending a lot of this first year simply getting to know one another, learning to understand one another's contexts, and then listening to community leaders and Indigenous advisors as they tell us what they want this project to focus on. As academics, I believe we need to be doing this research in a way that supports decolonization.
In a way, research is also telling a story. Something that has stuck out to me while going through these interviews and learning about this project is the emphasis on storytelling. I can't help but think of a quote from the late Cree storyteller, Harold R. Johnson, and this came from his final book that was published called The Power of Story, but he also talked about this idea in his book Firewater. And it is that we are the stories we are told, and we are the stories we tell ourselves. He goes on to say that stories are not part of your culture. Your culture is story. It is entirely story. Everyone's is. We are all the stories we are told. Our being is story. Our essence is story. Our vision is shaped by story. Our hearing, our morals, and ethics are all story. The wiring in our brains is shaped by story. Every thought you think is framed by story. And I'll just add that this is special because not only has our history and very being as Indigenous peoples been passed down through story, but we hold the power to control that narrative. It is so incredibly important that we tell stories of our brilliance and of what we believe our communities can look like. And if you keep telling that story and you don't stray, it will come to be. It is such an obstacle when there are so many stories being told over and over of only our trauma and hardships. But that isn't what we're going to do here.
Thanks for sharing that powerful quote from Harold R. Johnson, Tehya. And I want to quote you in the future as well on how you just ended that. And yes, a big part of what the Living Relations Project seeks to do is share the amazing stories of what's already happening on the ground in communities to build more resilient food systems. This is about the knowledge sharing that is taking place to rebuild traditional Indigenous food systems. And it's also about how this kind of work is influencing what we might call the mainstream food system, dominated by industrial agriculture and aquaculture, often to the detriment of the climate and biodiversity.
Thanks for that, Peter. We're heading into our final theme. One of the most exciting parts of listening to these conversations was hearing about what people are actually doing, the projects they're involved in, the knowledge they're revitalizing, and the change they hope to spark in their communities and beyond. You can really hear the sense of connection and possibility in the voices of the team members when they talk about this work, like in these reflections from Te and Eden.
I've really enjoyed this kōrero. I felt kōrero's conversation just feels so much connection, and I just feel it's buzzy. I can't describe it as anything else. To be like, we literally live on the complete opposite sides of the world. We literally operate on different time zones, but our shared history and similarities and the opportunity to support one another really inspires me.
There's one saying, what's good for Māori is good for all of New Zealand, and I think that's also a consideration with a lot of this knowledge sharing, and I do think, more knowledge sharing needs to happen in terms of these challenges, right? I mean, what's been shared so far for this camp is, the best mind in the room is the collective.
Yeah, so what kind of stories did you hear? What is happening on the ground that team members are excited to tell others about?
This is where the conversations really came to life, when people started sharing what they're actually doing in their communities to reclaim food systems and strengthen connections to land and culture. These stories of revitalization and resurgence were some of the most inspiring to listen to. One example comes from Eden, who is involved in rebuilding traditional food systems. His community has been working on many fronts, legal, environmental, and cultural, to protect their right to harvest eel.
I haven't had to go through this quite significant fight that those before me had to achieve this state and this privilege, but it's essentially exclusive rights to harvest eel from our lake. And when we think about that, that includes exclusive rights of who gets trained to write permits. So you require a permit, just like in many other countries, to catch from the freshwater or fishing game. We decide who writes those permits and who gets trained. Those people then can write permits for tribal members to fish from that lake. Those people that not just write the permits, but more broadly a tribal structure, agree on the acceptable fishing practices. And they are, in this case, the traditional fishing practices. Being recognised as a customary harvest lake, it meant that the take from that's illegal to sell, specifically eel. But what's the purpose of farming today? The primary purpose is to make money, right? But it's taking away the primary purpose of producing and sharing food. And that's what I like about not being able to sell it, is that this food is recognised and that food is going to people that need to eat and that have connection to it.
One of the things I love about Eden's community story, from what I know about it, and I've had a few conversations with him and others about Lake Aotearoa, is they had to push for changes at multiple levels of policy and governance to reclaim and revitalize their eel fishery, including getting the non-Indigenous farmers around his lake to use different farming practices to reduce the nutrient load on the lake, as an example. And that created better habitat for eel. So it's a multi-layered story that really brings his earlier point home. What's good for Māori is good for New Zealand more broadly. So what else did you hear, Tehya?
So Nikki shared so many beautiful things about her vision for her community and what she wants to see. And here's an example of the small but powerful steps they're taking to make it a reality.
One small thing that we've started doing is start teaching people preservation techniques again. It's like canning fish and drying fish and like doing those. So we're doing we just did a sausage and jerky making workshops teaching people how to preserve food themselves. And we did sourdough classes. So going back to kind of those more old school kind of ways of feeding yourself and more sustainable.
And finally, here's Te Awe, who talked about how her community is bringing back traditional knowledge systems tied to harvesting and living in rhythm with the land and moon.
So I think transition to food systems that better reflect our ancestral foods is a practice that is being revitalised, particularly, and this was something I wanted to ask about, we have what's called the maramataka, which is our interpretation of living by the moon, the phases of the moon cycles and the certain times of year that are best to grow certain crops. And then you start to see different indicators across the environment. So we have these traditional knowledge systems that we are reinvigorating.
What I love about these examples is how they show different approaches to the same goal. Eden's story focuses on policy, supporting traditional practices, Nikki's on teaching preservation skills, and Te Awe's on reviving ancestral knowledge about the environment. And it wasn't just about what's happening now. People also shared their dreams for how their communities can continue to grow their food sovereignty into the future.
Yeah, so thanks for sharing all of this with me, Tehya. I'm really looking forward to listening to these interviews in full now. And I wonder, how would you sum up what you've learned? What does this all mean for you as an emerging Indigenous scholar and food sovereignty advocate?
These conversations really just reminded me why I care so much about this work. Food sovereignty isn't just a policy issue. It's personal. It's about our families, our stories, and how we take care of one another. Listening to everyone's stories has shown me how much strength and knowledge already exists in our communities, and it motivates me to keep learning, keep listening, and keep showing up.
That's a fantastic way to sum this up, Tehya, so thank you. It sure makes me want to hear more. So what are the themes you want to dive into in the next episode?
There's so much more to talk about still, and I have more people to introduce to the listeners. In the next episode, we'll talk more about water protection, how community efforts address climate change and biodiversity crisis, and about the place of language and cultural revitalization in food work.
Great. I'm looking forward to that. And I look forward to introducing you and our audience to John, the Living Relations Co-Director from Aotearoa, in our next episode. So for now, let me thank you, Tehya, for being my co-host, as well as all the members of the Living Relations team, both those we heard from in this episode and those who we've yet to hear from. I also want to acknowledge the research assistants who made this episode possible. They helped with setting up a lot of those interviews that we heard from. They are Stella Oliver, Catherine Littlefield, and Sandos Katate. I also want to thank the Living Relations Project partners, Plenty Canada, the First Nation of Natchuniaktan, the First Nations Technical Institute, the Ngāi Tahu Research Center, and the Carleton Center for Community Innovation. So these conversations took place on the traditional territories of the Teme Ongama Anishinaabe. I know those lands and waters helped to animate these conversations and the great ideas that were shared then and now. So I just want to share our collective gratitude for the warm reception that our whole team received by the Bear Island community last August. And finally, let me thank our funder, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The supplemental materials for this show will point you to additional resources and materials coming from the Living Relations Project. These materials and other episodes of the podcast are found at the website ecopolitics.ca. We'd love it if you share our content, get in touch, and let us know what you think of the show. The Ecopolitics podcast is produced by Kaylee McIntosh and edited by Nicole Bedford. Adam Gibbard provides artistic design and digital support, and in this case was supported by Casey King doing the graphics for this episode and the next. The podcast is made available under a Creative Commons License 2.0. Thanks for listening and see you next time.